Bonjour, bonjour, bonjour. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Hello and welcome everybody to our last day. All right, I am here to welcome you today to our final keynote speaker. If you're still wandering around, I encourage you to find your place. Let's go and do this. So I am Walter Wittich. I'm the co-chair of the scientific committee for our conference here. And I found out recently through AI that I am a middle-aged white guy with glasses. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to the session with our final plenary speaker this morning, who is Dr. Tom Shakespeare. However, he is not going to join us live. He will be with us by recording for various technological and time change reasons, since he is in the UK. Tom Shakespeare is a professor of disability research at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and has published widely about disability and inclusion. His books include Disability, Rights and Wrongs, Genetic Politics from Eugenics to Genome, and The Sexual Politics of Disability. He has been involved in the disability rights movement for 35 years. Tom will share his perspectives on the virtual world, an opportunity or a threat for persons with disabilities. Without further ado, I give you Tom Shakespeare.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. I really want to talk about remote working and whether this recent crisis has the potential to liberate, to empower disabled people, including deafblind people. So let's think about what has happened pre-pandemic and during the pandemic and post-pandemic. So you don't need me to tell you how many barriers are there in the community for all disabled people, particularly for deafblind people. I'm a wheelchair user, so I could talk about buildings and public spaces that are inaccessible to me. I could also talk about transport barriers, so metros or buses or trains or aeroplanes that are inaccessible to me. You'll want me to emphasize communication barriers, the failure of people to understand how to communicate, the difficulties in interaction. I should also mention fatigue limitations, the fact that some people just cannot do what is expected of an adult human being. Interaction limitations. So, for example, some people find it very difficult, very tiring to be with other people because of their neurodivergence, perhaps, or mental health issues. They might find it very difficult to interact with people. And workplaces which have been inflexible, which have not accommodated the range of forms of human embodiment and therefore been inaccessible to disabled people. And contrast that with the pandemic. Now, the pandemic, I want to stress, is really problematic for disabled people. So, for example, in the UK, something like 16% of adults have disabilities, but deaths from COVID-19 were 59%. So, basically, approximately 4 times the risk of dying if you're disabled, and of course many disabled people are older people, than if you're non-disabled people. And this 3 or 4 times the mortality rate is widely found. A systematic review of international studies of disability and COVID mortality suggests that globally disabled people had a 2.7% higher mortality rate than their non-disabled peers. So I want to acknowledge, first of all, that COVID has been very bad for disabled people, as I say. 3 to 4 times higher mortality. However, every cloud has a silver lining. And one of the significant factors in the pandemic was the increased and often innovative use of online platforms and technologies for daily activities, keeping in touch with friends and family, participating in religious services, work, education, and accessing health and social support. And so many disabled people that we spoke to, and I'll be reporting on research we did with disabled people in the UK, many disabled people had very positive experiences of digital interaction during the pandemic. That connection I talked about to family and friends, Zoom-based classes and activities, providing structure to the day. A gentleman we spoke to, a young athlete with autism, continued training at home with online support from his athletics coaches despite being in lockdown. And much closer connections perhaps to her neighbours. One person in her 70s reported to us that although she lived in her neighbourhood since 1988, now there's, because of COVID, lots of link up with their neighbours, information, help, asking for stuff. And Hilda said, it's very good. It's a great improvement. But it's not all good. As one person said to us, and this is a woman with learning disability, intellectual impairment, I miss face-to-face contact and seeing everybody and seeing my friends face-to-face. And we used to go for a meal and have dinner and everything after drama. And it was great being able to give each other a little cuddle if we were feeling upset or if we just want to have a wee chat with each other. We've done that, but you can't do that on Zoom. So it's not always a substitute for face-to-face interaction. I think there are particular disability dimensions. So Zoom and digital interaction enables disabled people to avoid common access barriers, such as inaccessible buildings, transport, and improving their participation in society. People keep up, like this guy Julian, who said, I kept up with people on Zooms, not just Scotland or the UK, but around the world. And I've got 4 on Thursday, plus the nurse and I have got an invite in today for another meeting and another meeting. Sometimes 2 are on at the same time, so it can be quite exhausting. And clearly it was a benefit to him. And many disabled people were able to continue working and volunteering and have done well in their jobs. And that's really important because job retention, job advancement has been very difficult for disabled people. So lots of things that they can do, lots of interactions. And of course, with online digital interaction, somebody said to us, everyone's at an equal footing. Some people reported increased attendance of disabled people in meetings. And quote, now people could join without relying on someone else to take them to the meeting. Or it could just be them, on screen. So virtual meetings are very much enjoyed by many people. They don't have to travel. They don't have to interact if they have neurodivergence. They don't have to communicate or endure lack of communication, perhaps. But it's not always been accessible. Information about the pandemic was not always delivered in accessible ways. Online options were often limited for disabled people because, of course, everybody wants those supermarket delivery slots, and it's not always been easy for disabled people to access that. Or maybe shopping websites are inaccessible to people with visual impairments. Often the use of captions and alternative text lagged behind. So maybe schools moved to virtual interaction, but they weren't fully accessible. Many support services relied on the use of communication, digital interaction, which didn't consider people with impairments can make communication difficult. And so where reliance on digital continues and digital is not accessible, it's a real problem. It's been a real problem. And in particular for disabled people, there's what's called the digital divide. That disabled people are more likely to be excluded. Disabled adults make up in the UK a larger proportion of adult internet non-users. And the presence of disability is one of the strongest predictors of digital exclusion. In 2017, 56% of adult internet non-users were disabled, which is a much higher proportion. Remember, there are 16% of disabled adults in the UK, so 56% of non-internet users were disabled, so much, much higher. Between the ages of 16 and 24, 60%, more than half of internet non-users were disabled. So really problematic. Recent internet users, the proportion was much lower for adults who are disabled, 78%, compared with those who are not disabled. 95% had recently used the internet. So less access, use the internet less, and particularly for people with impairments like intellectual disability, dementia, visual impairment, where awareness and use of online services are much lower. So in a way, digital technologies might have actually increased the relative social exclusion and even the health inequality experienced by disabled people. And a scoping review of evidence on digital technology and health inequalities suggests that disabled people may have been left behind in the migration to telehealth. I mean, now, when I want to send a message to my GP, I do so through a website. Is that website accessible to people who are deafblind or have visual impairments? I don't think it is. And so that's what I mean by being left behind. The needs of disabled people are often excluded from guidelines on telehealth, and digital technologies for health are often not designed with access in mind, and neither are disabled people given access to digital skills training. So lots of rehabilitation services don't have clear guidelines and don't have the thought of people who are excluded. And of course, as somebody said to us, disabled people are less likely to have skills, less likely to use the internet. Several disabled people's organisations and non-government NGOs, non-governmental organisations, whom we interviewed in the UK, estimated that less than half of their members are digitally connected. So that leaves a lot of people who are not getting access to services. And this has got a lot of implications. If everything is online and less than half of your disabled people are online, then they're going to be excluded. They might not have a smartphone. They might not be able to download the information. In Britain at the moment, there is a proposal to close railway ticket offices. And what's been said is, look, people can go online. Well, not everybody is online. So older people, disabled people will be disproportionately excluded by this decision. So interaction is really difficult. And when I'm quoting from disabled people, we talk to them online. We recruited them online. So we probably underestimate the extent to which they were excluded. So this is somebody talking about a disabled person. For her to get internet access, she has to take 2 buses and go to the local library. We can't rely on it very much. Whereas if it goes wrong, they might not be included. They might not be connected. So might work for people who are connected, people who've got the devices. Lots of families, particularly poorer families, are not getting access. And what we found is that many organizations try to bridge this gap of access to the internet by providing devices like notebooks and iPads and similar to their members. For example, one group that we interviewed provided 4G-enabled tablets for their members because they were funded to have face-to-face meetings. Those are not going to be possible, and so they spent that money on giving tablets to their members. So it shows how the NGO sector have been really helpful. But of course, if a family has one form of internet accessibility, and they have mum and dad trying to work, and at least one child who's trying to do schoolwork online, that's not enough. And of course, if they don't have the device, the broadband, the training, they're excluded. If they can't pay for it, they're excluded. And I think it's really important for disabled disability groups to support with things like digital coaches, digital ambassadors, to help people set up and use their devices, help them get online. So digital literacy is very important. And of course, even when you can get online, even when you can get access, making sure that you have help towards better technologies, making sure that you have up-to-date software, making sure that your Dragon speech recognition technology is working properly, making sure there's enough processing power is really important. And the trouble is that a lot of technologies are not very accessible. I've mentioned when I have to contact the GP. Well, one person we're calling Ethan, who is deaf, it described how the GP video conferences system doesn't allow him to pin his sign language interpreter, so he couldn't view her in full screen, which made it impossible for her to communicate. So many people who do use Zoom, perhaps, can't do the telephone calls. And somebody talked to us, somebody with dementia, talked to us about how she could use Zoom, because it's just one click, but she couldn't dial a number. And she talked about being cut off completely. I can't use the phone. I've had numerous consultations. No one's seen or heard from me. It's just been my daughter speaking on my behalf because I can't do it. And we've asked for video calls, but we were told that we would have to go to the back of the waiting list if we wanted a video call. And the local GP surgery just doesn't do it. This guy, Arthur, described how community psychiatric nurses typically didn't use Zoom, which limited many people's use of mental health services. And then one person who spoke to us, Frances, noted that her learning disability nurse only does video calls, and she doesn't like that. She'd rather just have a phone call, not available anymore. Many participants said that statutory services will only use the Teams platform, but they found Teams hard to use. If a technology solution used by services is not accessible because of disability exclusion or digital exclusion or disability, is it really a solution? Is it really meeting their needs? If you have, for example, profound learning disability, intellectual disability, aren't you going to be left behind when more and more support services are invested in online classes? So this was very much what this guy, Jim, who had profound intellectual disability, his mum told us, that the schools would say they're providing Zoom services, so on paper it looks like they're providing a service, but this is not accessible to this person. He can't really respond well to online communication. And obviously, those who struggle to read or write experience a widening gap between them and their peers. If online delivery of occupational speech and language therapies, they might not be right for somebody. So it's great that they make an effort, but many caregivers told us about their frustration at the unwillingness or inability of services to pivot to an approach that works for their disabled person. And I quote, "The current social worker is saying, oh, we'll do a Zoom call with Ryan." And I'll say, he can't do Zoom. He can't do it. And so there's been a lot of criticism by social care that haven't been allowed to see him by Zoom. But he won't do it. He won't do telephone calls either. He can take a telephone call now for about 3 minutes, but he's unable to do Zoom. He just sat and cried. Somebody with learning disabilities there. You'd think that after someone set fire to their bedroom and things like that, someone having a serious meltdown where they're unable to cope, you'd think they'd be wanting to ring back, but they're busy and they can only offer Zoom. So it kind of amplified the exclusion that people with disabilities, children with disabilities might have, and it might make them feel even more socially isolated. This limitation to we're only going to use Teams, or we're only going to use Zoom or whatever. So this is particularly the case for people with intellectual disabilities. And so, daughters are being excluded from parents because she didn't understand communicating through a box. And one person who works for an organisation said that 50% of their members with intellectual impairments, intellectual disabilities, reported feeling extremely isolated. So this is the problem of having a one-size-fits-all solution. So the specific needs of people with different types of impairments are really useful. And what I'm going to do now is to highlight both the positive and the negative of different people that we spoke to in the UK. So for a start, people who have hearing impairments. But people who have hearing impairments who need sign language interpretation or lip reading don't have the option of avoiding video calls. And this comes at great cost. And so somebody called Ethan told us about the barrage of visual noise and how it couldn't be avoided. And he criticised the two-dimensional things, the things you couldn't pick up. And he said, deaf people like me need a 3D world. We need to see the movement of face and the body language and things like that. Otherwise, the eyes naturally have to keep adjusting for the 2D. It leads to what we call Zoom fatigue, because we're just watching. We can't even turn away for a second. When other people can turn away and be involved in the conversation, we can't. We just have to steer all the time. And it is very tiring. A number of conditions need to be met for many people to fully participate in digital interaction. For example, in online settings, all attendees need to be well lit, close to the camera for lip reading. Their connectivity needs to be adequate for live captioning or palantype to be accurate. So all of this is a much higher demand. It's not as simple as saying, oh, you're online, you're fine. And particularly where there's inadequate reasonable accommodation, particularly in social and healthcare setting, there are real risks of miscommunication. So it's not been thought through. Lots of problems. But around COVID, around health information, around people not understanding. As somebody said to us, the issue around remote services and remote care, that's not going to go away anytime soon. And the government should recognise that this was an issue for 12 million people that are deaf and have hearing loss. But now they really, really need to acknowledge the huge challenge that this will bring. If we go online more and more, it's going to be a problem. For those who have vision impairment as well, or instead, the negative experiences have often suffered from having little control over what's visible to others. So Kayla, who's blind and struggles with video call etiquette, particularly because the visibility is one-sided. She said to us, it's quite exhausting doing stuff virtually. It tires you out because you're sitting still in one position. You have to make sure that they can see you or not on a camera, and you don't know what the etiquette is. And actually, you're letting these people come into your home, but you would never normally let people come into your home. And the etiquette of visual communication is really difficult to navigate. You don't know if you should keep your camera on or not. People get distracted by other people's houses and things, and you know what their hair is like and their clothes and stuff. So that's what Kayla, who's an adult with visual impairment, told us. In terms of hearing impaired people, it might be information overload, but these digital interactions often provide insufficient information for visually impaired people. For example, interviewing your support workers over a Zoom call doesn't equate to meeting people in person. And so would somebody with hearing impairment trust this relative stranger to their homes because they haven't really got to know them, or forego this assistant? So yes, there are benefits. If you have a partial visual impairment, you can zoom in on faces where you might not be able to see before. That's what Mara said to us. She can consult her notes in in-person meetings, but that's difficult. But on a screen with text enlarged, it's much easier. So it's sometimes easier. But for those with dual sensory loss, who've got both hearing and visual impairments, the extent of digital interaction is often text voice. And Isla, whose social world shrunk to only her partner, severely impacting her mental well-being, describes her experiences with text voice, contrasting it with her interaction with friends pre-pandemic. And she said, yeah, I haven't seen any of them for donkeys, you know. Obviously we text, but because I can't see the video, I can't see what they're signing. So it's been a kind of text voiceover on my phone. How are you doing? How are things going? But I miss all that social scene. I do. We all get together, big groups of us, and we do hands-on signing. At the moment, that's gone out the window. So it's really just her, Isla, in her 50s, deafblind, and her partner. So what do we need to do right? We need to think about glare from screens. We need to think about splitting headaches from Zoom. Even if you can't see, it's giving you an effect, said Isla. Let's think about different platforms and their accessibility. So Kayla, for example, said, I can use Zoom, but there are many different kinds of platforms. So Zoom and Teams is fine, but what about Webinex and Collaborate and YouTube and Facebook? And there's so many different platforms. And because the way people send through links or connect through them, they don't always instruct you how to work it well, so it becomes difficult. And then there are people with other impairments. I mean, people with physical impairments generally have been able to participate, but not all people with physical impairment. Some people can't move their mouth because they have MS or other fatigue. And so they have to do everything by Dragon because they can't type. This woman needed a new computer because Dragon took a lot of processing power. If it goes wrong, I just give up, says Ashley. And it might be literally 2 weeks before I attempt it again because it's a real high cognitive load and fatigue with digital interactions for Ashley. So that's where flexibility is needed. That's where an understanding of the challenges faced, unhelpful demands, long meetings, frequent emails, the assumption that digital interactions are private when they may well not be. And of course, for folk with intellectual disabilities, it's good because they can get present with people, but it can be really difficult. It's good to be part of an online community, but maybe it's much less good to interact online than to interact face-to-face. Maybe big calls with lots of people or big trainings has been really difficult. Maybe you're struggling with your Teams or your Zoom because your intellectual impairment. So we need to think very much about the choice of platforms, and we need to recognise what people prefer. Some people with, say, intellectual disability may prefer digital interaction, others may find it inadequate, but everybody should be invited and included. I've talked about dementia, how many people who are in the dementia community have used Zoom for years. So suddenly they're in a way equal. I was told that send your slides in advance so you don't have to concentrate on watching the screen as well as listening. Make meetings smaller because there are too many people in these big meetings. Have the background plain. Don't be distracted. Allow for breaks. Keep sentences short. Keep presentations short. Avoid acronyms. Let you close your eyes. Sometimes you can't look and listen at the same time. People with mental health conditions, often complex experiences with digital interactions. For some, activities like online courses, online classes, provide structure and normality to break up the days which seem endless. For others, particularly those with anxiety disorders, these are overwhelming because being with people may already be a struggle. Some people with depressive disorders may long for company but struggle to feel connected through digital interactions. It might feel not like a human connection, so it's quite frazzling and exhausting. So, digital is not always accessible for people with mental health conditions. For some people, particularly people who have neurodiversity, the distance can be equalizing. It might be a struggle to interact in person, but actually it might be rather good online. Now, we did a longitudinal study. We talked to people twice. And what we found, and the quote that I used to headline this is, "I'd come to hate Zoom." Over the course of the pandemic, people really felt exhausted, particularly caregivers who, of course, were doing their work and supporting somebody. And, of course, rather than a child or adult being able to go off and do it all themselves, the caregiver had to do it all for them. Some people worried that digital interactions might become the norm. Others wondered whether meeting people in person might soon get tiresome again. So there were different views. Some people adore it. If they couldn't get out, they're the ones who can't travel. They want it to continue because it's actually brought them into the world. Others find it very difficult. They need adjustments. They need reasonable accommodation. They need self-care. It can be really difficult. If you've got a high fatigue day, you just can't do it. So you can't go to everything. And because the ultimate is that you, as it were, crash and burn. So we need a lot of self-awareness and a lot of autonomy to choose, to decide what is best. But of course, not all disabled people have that autonomy. They're struggling. They, as Lauren said, we struggle to find jobs and we have to rely on hobbies to get us through the week. So it's very different for disabled people to non-disabled people. Because disabled people are used to being excluded, and non-disabled people are used to taking part, are used to being part of the whole. So the way that they react to digital possibility is different. So what I've done is try to look at different impairments and look at the ways they were enabled or disabled. I just want to talk very briefly about now, because in many countries there is a drive to get people back into the office. So that is one thing. Disabled people were really cross because there's a pandemic, remote working became possible, and they've been asking for this all along. So there was sort of frustration that suddenly, because everybody needed it, this accommodation was suddenly available. But now people are going back into the office, and there's a pressure to get back in the office. At the same time, many who are working in the knowledge economy, say, are working at home more. Maybe all the time, or maybe they're only going to the office one day a week. There's more acceptance. So there's a tension between the desire to get people back into the office, to be buying their sandwiches, to be travelling on the trains, and the acceptance that now people will work from home. There's issues about whether the reasonable accommodation that was provided during the pandemic is still going to be available. Is it going to be dissolved? Are churches still going to be live streamed? Are people still going to be able to take part even if there isn't a regular meeting online? So lots of tensions there, but there's also a danger or frustration that if the virtual is seen as being the accessible solution, then it relieves the pressure to ensure communication, inclusion, physical accessibility, as it were, increases segregation. And not only that, obviously, it's if everybody stays at home, we have to radically rethink public transport and city centres and office spaces and all that sort. There's a lot of thinking that needs to be done. But this, as it were, segregation, this availability of online as a solution is worrying. As somebody said to us, I don't want, after this crisis is over, for people to say, oh, well, actually, we don't need to make that meeting accessible because disabled people, you can Zoom it or WebEx it or Teams it. And as this person actually said, it really worries me. We need to have carer support for digital interactions, which puts a big strain on carers, as well as a loss of privacy and independence for disabled people. Where people have unmet need for assistive devices, challenges multiply, including devices that couldn't cope with digital interactions to allow people to work or learn or socialise. So existing gaps in assistive technology, such as mismatches and poor supply, become particularly problematic. And although disabled people felt a sense of solidarity when the pandemic enforced confinement and isolation at home for everybody, they soon saw that structural inequalities still existed. While digital tools were made widely and freely available almost overnight, they didn't have accessibility and inclusion in mind. It's really problematic if non-disabled people's experience of digital tools keeps improving, as they have been as a result of the pandemic, while disabled people's access and experiences of digital tools does not improve. Non-disabled people's use of digital spaces rises, disabled people's plateaus. So this accelerates the digital gap and deepens the exclusion of disabled people in work, education and social spheres. So if we're to avoid further disablement created by the pandemic, we need to have urgent attention to promote digital literacy, to improve accessibility of digital tools and platforms, and to prioritise inclusivity in digital interactions. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a very good conference, and thank you very much for letting me contribute to it. Bye now.
Thank you for giving us your attention for the presentation of Tom Shakespeare today. It really strikes me, especially being at an event like this, many of these topics I reflect on them and I hear them from other people across different continents, different countries. We all have very similar experiences. There are these times where we then connect on the common problems, but what I really like about our conference is that we also connected about common solutions. And so in that spirit, on finding our connections and our global solutions, I encourage you now to head into a 30-minute refreshment break in the foyer. This is your final chance to engage with our exhibitors and our poster presenters. The Group A posters are presented at this time, and following the break, we're excited to bring to our stage Rick Mercer. If you don't know who that is, you will want to find out. One of Canada's most iconic comedians and a treasure to us all. Enjoy your break, and we will see you soon.